accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. In accordance with Rule 63 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly, the President and Vice Presidents of the 79th session shall serve in the same capacity at the resumed 10th emergency special session. Turning to the Credentials Committee, may I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to decide that the Credentials Committee of the 79th session should serve for the resumed 10th emergency special session. It is so decided. In keeping with established practice, I should now like to invite the attention of the General Assembly to document A/ES 10/1010 concerning member states that are in arrears in the payment of their financial contributions to the United Nations within the terms of Article 19 of the Charter. May I take it that the Assembly duly takes note of the information contained in this document. It is so decided. The General Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5 entitled, and I quote, Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the Occupied Palestinian Territory, end of quote. In connection with this item, the Assembly has before it a draft resolution issued as document A/ES 10/L 31/revision 1. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we are meeting today in the context of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legal consequences of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The advisory opinion is in pursuance of General Assembly Resolution A/RES/77/247 adopted in this very hall. In the terms of the court, it is incumbent upon the United Nations, particularly this Assembly and the Security Council, to consider the precise modalities and further action required to bring to an end as rapidly as possible the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. It is, of course, at the discretion of the General Assembly, where every member state has an equal voice and vote, to decide how to respond. This resumed 10th emergency special session is therefore a moment for reflection and dialogue. It is a moment to find a durable solution to the age-old Palestinian problem. As President of the General Assembly, who has vowed to serve with unyielding dedication to the Charter and the principles of the United Nations, it is, however, my duty to stress that international law The Charter of the United Nations and UN resolutions must be respected by all member states. Without prejudging the outcome of this special session, it is our collective duty as representatives of the international community to ensure that the principles of justice and the rule of law prevail. For without justice and the rule of law, Israelis and Palestinians alike will not attain what they long for most: peace and security. In our deliberations, we must not lose sight of the many lives lost, the staggering humanitarian challenges, and infrastructural destruction that continue to take place, particularly in Gaza in the past several months. I hope our gathering here will make a positive difference in the lives of the many who continue to suffer in this region and who look up to us to make the right decisions at this emergency special session. Thank you. I now give the floor to the observer of the Observer State of Palestine to introduce draft the resolution A/ES10/L31/revision 1.
Mr. President, I congratulate you for the assumptions of the presidency of the 79th session. Mr. President and colleagues, Palestine is an important part of universal history, and the Palestinian people is an integral part of humanity. Neither our country nor our people will disappear. But that is no excuse for ignoring the existential threat they are facing. Palestinians have carved in a reality of suffering and oppression, spaces of joy and accomplishment. Their spirit has remained free, even while they were in shackles. They have preserved hope when everything around them should have led them to despair. They have been true to their identity regardless of the price they had to pay. They have been steadfast in the purest of their inalienable rights, just like all other peoples. Mr. President, the Palestinians want to live, not survive. They want to be safe in their homes. They want their children to go to school without fear. They want to be free in reality as they are in spirit. Free to live, to come and go, free to determine their own fate, subject only to God and to no other. They want to be Palestinians, to be themselves, just be, neither heroes nor victims, just human beings with the simplest of dreams, or the greatest of aspirations, living in dignity, in peace and security in their homeland. The Palestinian people is an extraordinary people whose true desire is to lead an ordinary life. Palestinians want to live and thrive on their ancestral land, where the spirit of the forefathers and foremothers embraces them, where the suspended tales of their lives await to be resumed. Palestinians want for children to bury their parents after a long and beautiful life, rather than for parents to bury their children before they could know the meaning of life. Palestinian children do not need to grow through the lessons of terrifying pain. The lessons of life should suffice. Now the sky is full of children whose life was taken away way too soon and in the cruelest of ways. And the earth is full with children who have suffered, who were injured, paralyzed, orphaned, and traumatized. Mr. President, as we speak in these halls, coming together yet again to address this grave, historic injustice, 2 million people are being besieged, bombed, starved. They are being displaced over and over again with no safe haven anywhere, with death awaiting them everywhere. How many more Palestinians need to be killed before change finally takes place to stop this inhumanity? How many more Palestinians need to be violently displaced by the repeated attacks of Israeli settlers and occupation forces? How many more Palestinians need to be snatched in the middle of the night and thrown into an Israeli jail for years and years, childhoods lost, lives ruined? How much more denial of rights, dispossession, and destruction will it take for the world to finally not only react but act? Until the world not only takes a stance but takes a stand and firmly acts upon it, truly upholding the rule of law and human rights. Mr. President, the General Assembly requested from the International Court of Justice its authoritative opinion on the Israeli occupation, and the court upheld its mandate. Allow me to quote the court, and I quote, "The sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israelis' presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful." Unlawful. End of quotation. If we need to identify two cardinal rules, two pillars on which the international law-based order was built, they would be the right of peoples to self-determination and the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force. And these are the rules that Israel has been breaching openly and brazenly for decades without consequences. The court fulfilled its mandate by unequivocally identifying the legal consequences for Israel. All states and the United Nations, and by placing them before the General Assembly, the Security Council, and all states to take the necessary measures to ensure compliance with international law. This was a historic opinion. Let me repeat. This was a historic opinion, as this was the first time the court examined the Israeli occupation as a whole. Now that the court has answered the request, it is time for the General Assembly to uphold its mandate and for all states to uphold their own obligations to ensure Israel compliance with its own in the face of its blatant non-compliance and relentless breaches. The court's advisory opinion showed that there is no doubt about the facts or the law. But the law is not there to merely serve as a measuring stick of violations. It is there to prevent those violations, and when that does not work, it is there to punish them, to bring them to a halt, to ensure accountability, to ensure justice. Unchecked, undeterred Israeli impunity will only mean more and more Palestinians killed, maimed, detained, more destruction, more loss, more misery. It must be brought to an end. Only then can we expect a genuine change that could lead to peace and to the implementation of the two-state solution. Mr. President, a few voices have claimed that departure from the law or its abandonment was the only realistic way forward. But it is precisely the departure from the law or its breach without any consequence that led us here in the first place. No occupying power can have a veto right over the inalienable rights of the people under its occupation. Let me repeat. No occupying power can have a veto right over the inalienable rights of the people under its occupation. Those who think the Palestinian people will accept a life of servitude, a life of apartheid, are the ones who are not being realistic. Those who imagine the Palestinian people will disappear or surrender are the ones who are not being realistic. Those who claim that peace is possible in our region without a just resolution for the question of Palestine are the ones who are not being realistic. A few voices claim this is not the right time for such action. They always find good reasons to keep doing the wrong thing. But delayed justice is denied justice. The right time to do the right thing is always right now. The right time to do the right thing is always right now. While looking at a map, or worse, looking at the horrific situation on the ground, the matter may look inextricable, but the solution is right before our eyes. It is the one endorsed by the international community as a whole and enshrined in numerous United Nations resolutions. It is an independent and sovereign state of Palestine on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side in peace and security with Israel. So why are we allowing the destruction of the state of Palestine and of this solution when we know there is no viable alternative and we all understand the risk of an all-out conflagration? What is happening in Gaza today can be the last chapter of the tragedy endured by the Palestinian people, or will be the first chapter of an even more tragic reality for our region as a whole. What you do next matters. Act now to stop the killing, to stop the suffering, to stop these crimes, to stop this injustice. Mr. President, I have the honor to introduce the draft resolution under consideration in this emergency special session. This is the first time since we've received additional rights and privileges through resolutions that you have adopted. I am so honored to do that for the first time in the General Assembly. I am so tall, I go beyond the ceiling of this General Assembly. This emergency special session is entitled, and I quote, "Advisory Opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from Israelis' policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and from the illegality of Israelis' continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory," end of quotation. As contained in document A/ES-10/L.31/Rev.1. I want to thank more than the 40 countries so far that have co-sponsored the draft resolution. The draft resolution faithfully reflects the advisory opinion of the ICJ, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and it is grounded in international law and aims at furthering respect for its rule, for the Palestinian people, but for the international community as a whole. We thank all delegations that engaged on this text and have done our utmost to address their concerns while ensuring the text remains aligned with the opinion rendered by the court. The draft resolution in its preambular paragraphs reflects the determinations arrived at by the court, while focusing in its operative paragraphs on the obligations of Israel, all states, and the United Nations and other international organizations in accordance with international law. It also calls for a number of individual and collective actions to uphold the law and implement the relevant United Nations resolutions on the question of Palestine. It seeks action for accountability, the fundamental path for justice in any case, and Palestine cannot be the exception. Mr. President, I stand on this podium at this historic and tragic juncture to tell the Palestinian people that a change is going to come. A change is going to come. That their fate is not endless suffering and agony. That freedom is their bright right and their destiny. I stand on this podium to tell you that justice is the only path to peace, to call on you, to call on all of you to uphold international law, not sacrifice it on the altar of cold and reckless political calculations. I call on you to reject double standards, to treat my people with the respect they deserve, and to recognize the rights they are entitled to. We are not a people too many. We are not a problem. We are a nation that asks for nothing more than your nations, but can accept nothing less. We want to live in freedom and sovereignty and dignity and peace and security in our ancestral land. We are committed to the rule of international law and to justice and lasting peace in our region. This requires ensuring that same rules apply to all. No bias, no double standards, no exceptionalism, and no exception. Each country has a vote, and the world is watching us to see if we can live up to the commitments we undertake and to the principles we claim as ours at this historic and crucial juncture for humankind. Please stand on the right side of history, with international law, with freedom, with peace. The alternative is what you witness every day on your TV screens, and what the Palestinian people are enduring in their flesh. A different reality is possible. It starts now and here. Free Palestine, peace for all, and I thank you.
I thank the observer of the observer state of Palestine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is my first time speaking here at the General Assembly after the October 7 massacre. 11 months ago, a terrorist army invaded southern Israel. In a single barbaric assault on a Jewish holiday, they murdered over 1,000 of our citizens and carried out the most heinous atrocities in modern history. Hundreds of vibrant young Israelis were murdered while celebrating life at a music festival. Hundreds of innocent people peacefully sleeping in their homes with their families were slaughtered. Some burned alive while holding their loved ones, and hundreds more were taken hostage, dragged into a captivity more brutal than anything anyone could ever imagine. Even now, as we speak, over 100,000 Israelis remain displaced within their own country, unable to return home due to the relentless rocket attacks from Hamas in the south and Hezbollah in the north. Perhaps you have forgotten, but we did not start this war, nor did we choose it. We are fighting a war forced upon us. We are fighting for our homes, our families, our future. We fight because we have no other choice. Yet, despite the cruelties we have faced, despite the unprecedented terror unleashed upon our people, this assembly remains silent. I was certain that the first resolution that would be brought before you all would be the unanimous, unequivocal condemnation of terror, the rape, the torture, the kidnappings that took place on that darkest of days. Yet, there has been no condemnation, no resolutions. Instead, we gather here to watch the Palestinians' UN circus. A circus where evil is righteous, war is peace, murder is justified, and terror is applauded. How dare you continue this tradition of passing one-sided resolutions against Israel without even pausing to consider what the Israeli people have endured? Since October 7, this assembly has passed 2 resolutions on this matter. Yet, there has not been one word about Hamas and barely a word about the hostages. Those who contribute to this circus are not simply bystanders. You are participants, enablers, collaborators. Every vote you cast in support of this circus fuels the violence and emboldens those who reject peace. This empty show is not just an insult to the victims of October 7, an insult to the hostages. It is an insult to the very fabric of this institution. You are not promoting today peace and justice. You are dancing to the tune of your ringmasters, the Palestinian Authority. Look at this picture. Look at it closely. Study it. That blood on the floor belongs to 6 beautiful human beings: Eden, Hirsch, Alex, Carmel, Ori, and Almog. That is their blood. 6 innocent Israelis executed in cold blood after months of suffering in this tiny, dirty tunnel where they couldn't even stand, hidden under a child's bedroom. Imagine that being your child, your spouse, your friend. Imagine them for a moment suffocating, starving, bleeding in a dark hole for months. If it were your child, your loved one, would you sit in silence? Would you pretend this was just another story? Or would you scream for justice? Let me say this clearly. Jewish blood is not cheap. The days when it could be spilled without consequence are over. The days when the Jewish people were at the mercy of tyrants are over. Never again will we stand by while our people are massacred. Never again will we depend on your mercy or your judgment to protect us. Thank God that today we can defend ourselves. Today we have the strength to protect our state. Today we have the resolve to secure our future. So instead of condemning Hamas's brutal murder of over 1,200 Israelis, innocent men, women, and children, the Assembly sits silently. In place of this most basic common sense action, this circus focuses on distractions. The process that all other countries usually follow has been abandoned. Where are the negotiations, the deliberations? You have allowed the Palestinians to become the ringmasters, and those who vote for this resolution are playing their part. This resolution distorts the flawed advisory opinion of the ICJ. It ignores the truth, twists the facts, and replaces reality with fiction. It ignores completely. I didn't hear Mr. Mansour mentioning Hamas for the last 30 minutes he spoke here. It ignores the Hamas terror attack of October 7, ignores Israel's legitimate security concerns, and seeks to remove Israel's ability to protect itself. From the beginning, we all know that this process was politicized. This was not a quest for legal clarity, but a predetermined attempt to delegitimize Israel on the world stage. Let's call this for what it is. This resolution is diplomatic terrorism, using the tools of diplomacy not to build bridges, but to destroy them. And what other member state is treated that way? The answer is simple: none. No other country is subjected to such relentless, obsessive abuse. You know, it's not my first term here. I started my first term at the UN in 2015. Since then, there have been 155 General Assembly resolutions condemning Israel. In the same period, there have been only 88 resolutions condemning every other country combined. Combined. Think about the last decade. Think about how many brutal regimes exist in the world. Think about the countless injustices. Yet, the only Jewish state, the only democracy in the Middle East, has been condemned almost twice as much as the rest of the world combined. This is not about justice. It is about an attempt to destroy Israel through diplomatic terrorism. Make no mistake, since October 7, the Palestinian Authority has not condemned the atrocities committed by Hamas. Not one word of condemnation from President Abbas. Not one word from Prime Minister Mustafa. Not one word from Riyad Mansour. The Secretary General of Fatah Central Committee called the October 7 massacre a defensive war full of epics and heroisms. One of the most high-ranking Palestinian officials calling the rape and murder of thousands of civilians epic and heroic. Are these our partners in peace? The PA have offered their unwavering support for Hamas, the world's most despicable terrorist organization. They are its diplomatic wing, its public face, their consiglieres. The Palestinians deserve better leadership. For decades, Hamas has spent its money digging terror tunnels, arming terrorists, and bringing ruin to its own people. Rather than building up Gaza, Hamas has obsessed over one thing: destroying Israel. While Hamas digs tunnels, the Palestinian Authority works above ground, attempting to isolate Israel internationally. There are two sides of the same coin, one attacking with rockets, the other with resolutions. The Palestinian Authority has rededicated itself to supporting the world's most vicious terrorist. This is not an entity seeking peace. It is a regime that glorifies murder while educating its people to do the same. They refuse to denounce the most horrific crimes. They celebrate the slaughter of civilians as a victory. And now, this body is considering rewarding that refusal, rewarding that evil. You are giving a false prize to false leadership. There is only one side in this conflict that promotes genocide. It is the one that promotes it publicly. Let us not forget, Hamas's own founding charter calls, and I quote, for the extermination of all Jews. They proudly proclaim their intent, and I quote, to wipe Israel off the map and hunt Jews wherever they can find them. Instead of condemning the killers, the ones who want to commit a genocide, this resolution condemns the victims. How dare they accuse us of the crimes they themselves are committed to carrying out? This resolution seeks to deflect blame for Hamas's own atrocities onto Israel, which is forced to defend itself. This resolution perfectly represents the priorities of the Palestinian Authority. It slanders Israel, ignores our right to defend our people, and seeks to isolate us. The PA has teamed up with the radicals in the region, posing a grave threat not just to Israel, but to the entire Middle East. But instead of addressing these major threats, some of you support this resolution, which demands that Israel tie its ends. History has shown time and time again that true progress only comes through direct dialogue. Israel has demonstrated this for decades. Wonderful, important peace treaties have been signed with Egypt, Jordan, with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, Morocco. Inshallah, there will be many more in the near future. Trying to isolate and destroy Israel brings nothing but regression. This resolution doesn't move the region forward, it drags the region backward, delaying the hope for peace and advancement. I was here on this podium 6 years ago. I stood in this hall and proposed a resolution to condemn Hamas. But instead of taking action, the Assembly chose to look the other way, allowing Hamas to continue its reign of terror. And now we are all, Israelis and Palestinians alike, suffering the consequences of your inaction. Back then you chose to support the circus over morality, and here we are again, the same circus, the same performances. But we all know what's really happening here. This is not about peace. This is not about international law. This is about posturing. In the circus of the UN, you can ignore the atrocities that took place on October 7. You can pass resolutions detached from reality. You can pretend you live on a different planet. But in the real world, outside these halls, we are doing the hard work. We are fighting terror. We are working to bring the hostages home. In the real world, there is justice and morality. In the real world, Israel will shape its own future, striving for both victory and peace. Israel will defend itself. We will not apologize for protecting our citizens. We will not stop until Hamas is dismantled, until every one of our hostages is returned, and until the terror that threatens our people is eliminated. Today, this Assembly faces a choice. You can choose to stand on the side of justice, on the side of peace, on the side of those who seek real solutions to the region's challenges, or you can indulge this circus, this charade, this political theater. Israel is ready to work with the international community. We are ready to work with those committed to real peace, real security, real progress. Israel will not work with those who refuse to renounce violence and acknowledge Israel's right to exist. Whoever supports this resolution today should be ashamed of themselves. On the day when your civilians, your families, your loved ones are murdered, raped, and kidnapped, do not come to this assembly seeking justice. All you will find is silence. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Israel. I now give the floor to His Excellency Peya Mushilenga, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of Namibia.
Mr. President, allow me to firstly congratulate you on your election as the President of the 79th session of the General Assembly. I also thank you for commencing your tenure by reconvening the 10th Emergency Special Session on illegal Israeli actions in occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory at the request of member states. This meeting takes place 2 months after the International Court of Justice rendered its seminal advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from Israeli policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and for the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. Namibia strongly supports and welcomes this advisory opinion, which we believe must be actioned through our collective effort to ensure it delivers for the people of Palestine. In convening this meeting, the General Assembly is, as rendered in the advisory opinion, able to consider precise modalities and further action to bring to an end as rapidly as possible the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. The request for this August Assembly to seek an advisory opinion from the ICJ was anchored in the fervent belief that the international judicial system can provide rational advice to assist us in charting the way forward on the question of Palestine, among the oldest unresolved agenda items for the General Assembly. Mr. President, the convening power of the General Assembly must continue to be used as a tool to effect meaningful change. As the world's most representative multilateral institution, the United Nations General Assembly continues to be an apt platform for the articulation of the voices of all nations of the world. We declare unequivocally in this August forum that there is no substitute for peace, and therefore move that Israel should henceforth genuinely commit to ending its 57 years occupation in line with ICJ advisory opinions, General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. We must work in unison, using all legitimate means at our disposal to halt Israel's non-compliance with international law. The resolution tabled before us in this emergency special session is to be considered before an assembly that has repeatedly affirmed its strong support for the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The same assembly has also affirmed the right of the Palestinian people to statehood. It is incumbent on all member states to fulfill in good faith the obligations they have assumed in accordance with the UN Charter. Further, member states should take cognizance of the consequential nature of the ICJ advisory opinion, and that jointly and severally, member states and international organizations, including the UN, are ascribed onerous responsibilities. Primary among these responsibilities is the obligation not to recognize the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and moreover, not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, Namibia has co-sponsored this resolution and will vote in its favor out of the fervent belief that its adoption would signify the international community's steadfast commitment towards ending impunity and supporting the progress towards lasting peace in the Middle East. We believe in exuding responsibility and duty to humanity. Accordingly, we encourage similar conscionable action from all member states. The resolution provides the international community with another opportunity to take a unified position in reasserting the key tenets of international law. Further, it reasserts the primacy of self-determination as an inalienable right that is not subject to the conditions of the occupying power. The resolution also sends a strong message to the world, and most especially to the Security Council, on the desires of the majority of the international community. Council members cannot continue to use veto power to perpetuate injustice and support impunity. More so, not at the time when the people of Palestine are ensnared by stalled ceasefire negotiations and a derailed peace process. While Council fails to execute its core responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, Gaza continues to be obliterated, offering no safe havens for civilians and humanitarian personnel. Infrastructure, including medical facilities, continues to to be destroyed viciously, demonstrating callousness by the occupying power. Equally, the situation in the West Bank continues to deteriorate daily. This is particularly worrisome. The international system must offer more than mere words of solidarity to the people of Palestine. It is high time that tangible steps are taken to oblige Israel to end its atrocious attacks on the occupied Palestinian territory. In conclusion, Mr. President, Namibia will continue to tirelessly champion the cause for the total liberation of Palestine. We are pleased to see Palestine seated among the family of nations and will continue to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the full membership of Palestine to the UN, and a renewed vision of a two-state solution that will enable the reconstruction of Gaza, leading to an independent Palestinian state, a safe Israel, and peace in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Minister for International Relations and Cooperation of Namibia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cameroon, who will speak on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of member states belonging to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in my capacity as the chair of the group. Mr. President, let me begin by commending you for the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session. There is no doubt that the present editions of the session, which were dedicated to addressing the grave humanitarian condition in the occupied Palestinian territory, have achieved positive outcomes, giving 3 landmark resolutions adopted by this august assembly since October 2023. The resolution on the need for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory, and global support for the admission of Palestine as a full-fledged member of the United Nations have justified the residual and complementary role of the United Nations General Assembly within the context of the maintenance of international peace and security. The group think that it is deeply regrettable that despite the hopeful expectation following the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2728 on March 25, 2024, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, the human rights and humanitarian calamities in the occupied Palestinian territories have worsened. The death toll, predominantly women and children, has tragically reached an unprecedented number of 41,680. Additionally, over 1,525 people were injured and hundreds of thousands were displaced following the destruction of their homes, hospitals, and heritage and cultural sites. In view of the foregoing and given the grave threat to peace and security resulting from the long-drawn Middle East crisis, for our group, it is high time that practical measures be taken to end Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. Accordingly, our group reiterates the call by the OIC on member states of the United Nations to exert diplomatic, political, and legal pressure and take necessary deterrent measures to stop the crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing committed by Israel, the occupying power, on the occupied Palestinian Territory and Gaza. In this connection, our group welcomes and commends the objective of this emergency special session to consider an urgent follow-up action on the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, as well as the illegality of Israel's continued presence at the occupied Palestinian territory. Similarly, Mr. President, our group reiterates the recent OIC resolution adopted at the 50th Council of Foreign Ministers held in Yaoundé, Cameroon, on 29-30 August 2024, welcoming the historical advisory opinion of the ICG on illegal Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory and the legal consequences for Israel, the United Nations, and third parties, especially the ICG legal opinion, adjust the continued presence of the State of Israel on the occupied Palestinian territory to illegal, thus affirming Israel's obligation to end the presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. Mr. President, the advisory opinion of the ICG for our group, which was issued upon the request of this esteemed assembly, has determined the legal occupation of UN member states and international organizations with regard to the immediate implementation of the various provisions of the legal opinion by the principal judicial arm of the United Nations. Consequently, for our group, the draft resolution being presented today is properly anchored on the principle of international law as contained in relevant UN resolution and the judicial discrimination arising from the ICJ advisory opinion. It is therefore imperative to implement the ICJ advisory opinion on the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestine, including the assertion that Israel must end as unlawful presence, cease settlement activities, evacuate settlers, provide reparation, and that state and international organization should not recognize or aid Israel's illegal action on the occupied Palestinian territory. While commending this draft resolution for the overwhelming votes in favor and adoption by member pressure and take necessary deterrent measure to stop the crimes against humanity, war crime, and ethnic cleansing committed by Israel, the occupying power on the occupied Palestinian territory. In this connection, and in fact, the Assembly, in accordance to our group, it is important to note that your anticipated positive action would provide the needed respite in this long-drawn crisis in Palestine. Without doubt, this resolution will also contribute to the end of the settler colonial occupation of Palestine, which has always been at the heart of the Palestine crisis. Indeed, the global consensus, as evident from the various UN resolutions and relevant regional organizations, is that the definitive peaceful settlement of the Israel-Palestine crisis resides in a two-state solution, the realization of the inalienable national right of the Palestinian people and the establishment of an independent Palestine state on the 1967 borders, which is Jerusalem as its capital. Ultimately, the implementation of various UN resolutions remains the responsibility of this global body and all its peace-loving members. Finally, Mr. President, for our group, the adoption of the draft resolution in the run-up to the Summit of the Future represents a beacon of hope for the global transformation which we seek to realize in order to confront a growing range of catastrophic and existential risk attendant on the persistent crisis and breakdown within the global setting. I thank you all for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cameroon. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda, who shall speak on behalf of the non-aligned movement.
Mr. President, I'm honored to speak on behalf of the 121 member states of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM. I thank you for your swift response to the request to resume this 10th emergency special session, pursuant to the joint request made by the chairs of the Non-Aligned Movement, Arab Group, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation on behalf of their member states. NAM welcomes the advisory opinion that was rendered by the International Court of Justice on 19th July 2024, pursuant to the request made by the General Assembly in its resolutions 77/247 of 30th December 2022. The determinations made by the court in accordance with international law require immediate follow-up by the Assembly to address this prolonged historic injustice, and particularly considering the extremely grave and worsening situation being endured by the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. NAM reiterates that respect of the UN Charter, international law, and UN resolutions constitute the foundation for a just and lasting solution of the Palestinian question as a cornerstone for regional and global peace and security. NAM acknowledges the role of the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in promoting justice and a peaceful settlement of international disputes in accordance with the relevant provisions of the UN Charter and the Statute of the ICJ. The Non-Aligned Movement urges the Security Council to make a greater use of the ICJ, the principal judicial organ of the UN, as a source of advisory opinions and interpretation of relevant norms of international law to guide and assist international efforts to justly resolve protracted crises and conflicts and promote peaceful resolutions. We further urge the court, the Council, to consider that its decisions be reviewed by the ICJ, bearing in mind the need to ensure their adherence to the UN Charter and international law. The General Assembly has rightly availed itself of the ICJ in seeking its authoritative guidance regarding this prolonged crisis, the question of Palestine, which has been on the United Nations agenda since the organization's inception. The Assembly's decision to turn to the court has been made after decades of the injustices endured by the Palestinian people, including the deprivation of their inalienable right to self-determination, the colonization and annexation of their land, and the discrimination amounting, as affirmed by the court, to violations of Article 3 of the CERD concerning racial segregation and apartheid. In response to the General Assembly's questions, the court has clearly determined earlier that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, is unlawful and must be ended as rapidly as possible. It is now time to translate the court's authoritative determinations into action for accountability towards ending this illegal occupation in all its manifestations and ensuring the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including to self-determination and independence and the realization of a long-delayed justice. Mr. President, in this regard, the movement reiterates that the policies and measures being carried out in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, by Israel, the occupying power, constitute grave breaches of international law and flagrant defiance of UN resolutions, and the 9th July 2004 and 19th July 2024 advisory opinions of an International Court of Justice. In this regard, the movement recalls the responsibilities of states not to support, facilitate, or cooperate directly or indirectly with such unlawful policies and to undertake practical measures to bring them to a halt. We also urge the undertaking of serious efforts collectively and individually to ensure respect of the legal obligations defined in the ICJ Advisory Committee, including efforts by the General Assembly and by the high contracting parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention. The movement stresses that the UN Charter contains sufficient provisions regarding the use of force, including a clear pronouncement on the inadmissibility on the acquisition of territory by force. This prohibition must be respected in all circumstances in order to maintain and preserve international peace and security in full conformity with the relevant charter provisions, including in earlier chapters 6, 7, and 8 of the charter as appropriate and consistent with international law as pronounced by the ICJ. In recent years, the Security Council has made too quick to threaten authorized enforcement action in some cases and has been increasingly resorting to Chapter 7 of the Charter as an umbrella for addressing issues that do not necessarily pose an immediate threat to international peace and security, while being silent and inactive in others, such as Palestinian question, that the ICJ considered it in its advisory opinion as conflicts continues to pose a threat to international peace and security and remains a matter of grave concern to the international community. Now reiterates the demand that Israel, the occupying power, immediately cease all such violations of international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and fully abide by its legal obligations, including under the 4th Geneva Convention. NAM also notes the 29th December 2023 application filed by member states of the movement, South Africa, instituting proceedings against Israel before the ICJ concerning alleged violations by Israel of its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crimes of Genocide in relation to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. To conclude, the movement seizes this opportunity to reiterate its long-standing call for immediate collective international efforts to uphold international law to bring an end to this grave and historic injustice. Now member states reaffirm their commitment to promoting a just, lasting, comprehensive, and peaceful solution to the question of Palestine in all its aspects in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions. NAM reaffirms its support to the Palestinian people in their struggle to achieve justice and fulfill their inalienable rights and legitimate national aspirations, including to return and to self-determination, freedom and independence in their sovereign and independent state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and stands ready to cooperate with and support the General Assembly and Security Council for the fulfillment of their respective responsibilities in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, who shall speak on behalf of the Arab group.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the Arab group. At the outset, allow me, Mr. President, to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the 79th session of the General Assembly. We wish you all success in this noble mission. I also thank you for responding to the request submitted by the Arab group, the Islamic group, and the non-alignment movement to resume the 10th emergency special session. Pursuant to the advisory opinion issued by the ICJ on the 19th of July 2024 on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the illegal presence of Israel in the occupied territories. This advisory opinion confirmed that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, and that Israel is under obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, and to cease immediately all new settlement activities, to dismantle the settlements and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. The advisory opinion also states that Israel has the obligation to make reparation for the damage caused to all natural or legal persons concerned, and that all states and international organizations are under the obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of Israel. The Arab group welcomes this advisory opinion which was issued upon the request of the General Assembly. We emphasized the need to follow up on this advisory opinion and to implement it in line with the advisory opinion of the ICJ in its 9th operative clause, which states that the United Nations, and especially the General Assembly and the Security Council, should consider the precise modalities and further action required to bring to an end as rapidly as possible the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, pursuant to the advisory opinion of the ICJ, the delegation of the State of Palestine, with the support of dozens of member states, tabled draft resolution before you today as contained in this document. And on this opportunity, we would like to congratulate the State of Palestine for starting to enjoy the rights and additional privileges defined by the General Assembly starting this 79th session. As a result, the Palestinian delegation was able today to table the historic draft resolution. The Arab group looks forward to the day the State of Palestine will be granted full membership in the United Nations as soon as possible. Ladies and gentlemen, almost a year after the onset of the wanton Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, this genocidal war waged by the Israeli occupation forces has led to the killing, injuring, and disappearance of more than 145,000 Palestinian civilians. In addition to displacing 2 million Palestinians and to the systematic destruction of cities, villages, Palestinian camps, and Palestinian infrastructure, to burning and destroying homes, farms, and property. Furthermore, Israel, the occupying power, and the settler gangs have expanded the scope of their crimes to include the West Bank. They have killed hundreds of Palestinian citizens, and they have gravely injured many more. The Arab group strongly condemns the crimes perpetrated by the Israeli occupation against the Palestinian people. We call for their immediate unconditional ending. We also condemn the hostile policies and measures adopted by Israel, the occupying power, to prevent the independence of the State of Palestine. We condemn their plans to annex the occupied West Bank and to expand the colonizing settlements in the other Palestinian territories and the occupied Syrian Golan. The Arab group reiterates its condemnation of the ongoing Israeli aggression for more than 11 months against brotherly Lebanon. We condemn the deliberate Israeli bombardments of civilian areas, which led to the killing of more than 175 civilians, most of whom are women and children, in addition to several journalists and relief workers. The group reiterates its condemnation of the repeated Israeli aggressions against the Syrian territories and the targeting by the Israeli occupation forces of civilians, of residential neighborhoods, and of the infrastructure. The group reaffirms its solidarity with Syria and Lebanon and calls for a cessation of the hostile Israeli actions immediately to avoid further escalation threatening regional and international peace and security. Mr. President, the General Assembly has resumed its 10th emergency special session on 3 occasions throughout the past 11 months. It has adopted 3 important resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire and to guarantee the delivery of humanitarian assistance, in addition to granting additional privileges to Palestine. The members of the General Assembly are invited today again to show their support to the Palestinian people and its prolonged struggle to end the Israeli occupation of their land and to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination, to the establishment of their sovereign independent state with Jerusalem as its capital, and to be granted full membership in the United Nations. Solidarity with the Palestinian people and their legitimate rights means that we should support the draft resolution tabled before this session and vote in its favor. This is the least we can do to contribute to lifting the prolonged historic injustice that befell the Palestinian people. Mr. President, allow me to deliver the following remarks in my national capacity. My delegation associates itself with the statement of the Arab Group and the statement delivered by the Permanent Representative of Uganda on behalf of NAM. We congratulate you once again for presiding over this session, and we affirm that my delegation is ready to provide all support for the success of your endeavors. We also thank you for swiftly responding to our request to convene this emergency session. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic reiterates its strong condemnation of the ongoing barbaric Israeli aggression against the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This aggression represents a continuation of the massacres, acts of aggression, and terrorism perpetrated by the Israeli occupation throughout decades to perpetuate its occupation of Arab territories and in an attempt to undermine the chances of establishing a Palestinian state. Syria reaffirms its full support to the brotherly Palestinian people in facing the Israeli killing machinery and in their struggle to end occupation and to enjoy their inalienable established rights, including their right to establish an independent state with Jerusalem as a capital and to be granted full membership in the United Nations. My country welcomes the advisory opinion of the ICJ and calls for its implementation to end the Israeli occupation. Syria reaffirms that the Israeli occupation was and still is the main cause of the instability in our region. Syria calls upon the United Nations to act immediately to implement its relevant resolutions and to end occupation, to end the policies of aggression, of expansion, of settlement, and of genocide, in addition to the war crimes, crimes against humanity perpetrated by the occupying powers. The occupying powers wouldn't have persisted in these practices if it weren't for the unlimited support provided to it by the US administration and some of their allies. Syria calls upon the United Nations to end the repeated Israeli aggressions against its territories, including the most recent assault against rural Hama province and Majd al-Shams in Arab Syrian occupied Golan. We call for holding the occupying powers accountable for their practices and to ensure that they are not repeated in order to avoid dragging the region towards more escalation, threatening regional and international peace and security. My country reaffirms its established right to defend its territorial sovereignty and to recover the occupied Syrian Golan using all the means provided by international law. We also condemn the ongoing Israeli aggression against Lebanon. We reiterate our strong solidarity with the Lebanese people and call for an immediate, unconditional cessation of such an aggression. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Mr. President, I'd like to begin by congratulating you on your recent appointment as President of the General Assembly. We extend our good wishes for success to the rest of the General Committee that you will be leading this year. Chile aligns itself with the statement delivered by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. We're grateful for the convening of this 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly to discuss a draft resolution tabled by Palestine entitled Following Up on the Advisory Opinion of the International Court of Justice addressing the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and from the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. Our country co-sponsored this draft, and we urge you to support it. We recall that on the 30th of December 2022, in its resolution 77/247, this same General Assembly adopted an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice entitled Israeli Practices That Affect the Human Rights of the Palestinian People in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem. At that time, my country voted in favor, as we will do this time. Chile has insisted that the relevant resolutions that support the right of the Palestinian people to constitute a sovereign state must be faithfully and fully complied with. These include resolutions 181 and 242 of this General Assembly. It also includes related resolutions such as Security Council Resolution 2334, which reaffirms that the establishment of settlements by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and represents a violation of international law. We reaffirm our support to the State of Palestine to be admitted as a fully fledged member of the United Nations. President, we wish to express once again Chile's condolences to the families and loved ones of the victims who have died in the conflict afflicting the Gaza Strip, whose number rises with every day that passes. We are particularly sensitive to the suffering of innocent women and children in this catastrophe. We underscore that violence is not resolved with more violence. We extend our profound solidarity to the wounded. We reiterate our full support to the dedicated and brave work carried out by the United Nations, by its agencies, and particularly by UNRWA on the ground. And we express our heartfelt sympathy at the death of more than 220 officials of UNRWA during this war. For this reason, we were moved to hear last week of the Israeli attack on an UNRWA school in which 18 people died, including 6 of UNRWA's workers. This is totally unacceptable and a clear violation of international law. We recall Resolution 2730 of the Security Council, adopted on 24 May this year. This urges the parties to the conflict to comply with obligations under international law and calls on all states to undertake immediate, detailed and impartial investigations into the violations perpetrated against humanitarian and UN staff. We underscore that the protection of human life must be our highest priority, and the protection of civilians is a fundamental obligation. For this reason, the UN Charter, international law and international humanitarian law must be respected. Undoubtedly, this respect has been violated by the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October last year, and also by the indiscriminate response of the State of Israel on the population living in the Gaza Strip, which has also affected the West Bank. Chile has unequivocally condemned the actions of Hamas and all terrorist acts and violent and hostile acts against the civilian population. For this reason, we demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held by Hamas, ensuring their well-being and treatment in line with international law. We are concerned by the siege imposed by Israel on the Gaza Strip. It has left its population unable to meet their basic needs in food, water, medicine, fuel, leading to widespread hunger and disease. We condemn Israel's military offensive against the city of Rafah. The consequences of this military operation are damaging and have only swelled the instability in the region. we are deeply concerned to see the prolonged violence. We echo the call of the Secretary General and the heads of UN agencies to ease the tensions. We applaud the efforts of the humanitarian coordinator, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, and we call for her to receive all necessary assistance to be able to carry out her work. We're grateful for the clear briefing that she gave to the Security Council yesterday, on Monday. Chile requests an immediate permanent ceasefire, greater flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, guarantees for the full, immediate, safe, unhindered and sustained access of humanitarian aid. This would require the lifting of all obstacles to that assistance and the opening of all available land routes into the Gaza Strip. We commend the vaccine campaign against polio that is being carried out during humanitarian pauses in Gaza. We encourage the aid teams in their work to reach more and more children at risk. We encourage all involved parties, as well as the international community, to continue working to bring an end to this war. This is only possible through diplomacy and dialogue. We recognize the efforts and results of friendly countries to ease the tensions, and we hope that the good offices of the United States, Egypt and Qatar can lead to concrete results. We underscore the 4 resolutions adopted in the Security Council in order to achieve a ceasefire to lessen the violence or to facilitate humanitarian assistance, 2712 and 2720 adopted last year, and particularly 2728 and 2735 from this year. We recall that all of that body's resolutions are binding and must be complied with and respected. Mr. President, Chile promotes the two-state solution and the right of Israel and Palestine to live in harmony within internationally safe and recognized borders with full respect for human rights of all of their inhabitants. Chile has always reaffirmed that it will contribute to reaching a peaceful settlement in the Middle East as a priority of our foreign policy. We have constantly stated our support for a just and lasting solution in line with UN resolutions. We recall that Chile, together with Mexico, sent to the International Criminal Court a submission on the situation in Palestine to bolster the investigation into alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Israel. For Chile, shedding light on the facts and responsibility as well as accountability are essential to bring an end to impunity and to prevent the future commission of international crimes. We underscore that the interim measures adopted by the International Court of Justice must be complied with by all parties. On Thursday last week, Chile presented to the International Court of Justice its submission following the case brought by South Africa against Israel. This relates to the implementation of the application of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip. This statement was presented in line with the provisions of Article 63 of the Court's statute. This establishes the right of any state to intervene in matters pertaining to the interpretation of a convention or a treaty to which they are a party. This national submission is focused on an analysis of the specific provisions of the Genocide Convention, as well as Chile's position on its interpretation. The text also alludes to the recent advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences of the policies and practices of Israel in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem, dated the 19th of July 2024. In that advisory opinion, the court concludes that the regime of comprehensive restrictions imposed by Israel on Palestinians in the Occupied Palestinian Territory represents, I quote, a systematic discrimination based inter alia on race, religion, or ethnic origin, end quote. In our national submission, we maintain that the International Court of Justice must grant particular importance to the content of the statements of certain high-level Israeli public officials who have called for the killing of everyone living in Gaza or for their civilian status to be disregarded. Furthermore, the submission also affirms that direct incitement and public incitement to commit genocide is a standalone crime punished under the Convention, even where it doesn't lead to the result expected by the perpetrator, where there is even where there's no causal link between what is said and subsequent acts, and where no act of genocide results therefrom. President, to conclude, I would like to share the following thought. In a few days' time, we'll be celebrating the Summit of the Future. We have worked together hard to agree a pact for the future. However, there will be no sustainable future if we do not address and resolve situations that are just as serious as that is currently being experienced in the Gaza Strip. It's firstly fundamental for the lives of the people living in that territory, but also for the United Nations as an organization that was born to guarantee peace and security. If we are committed to renewed multilateralism, let us also commit to a world in which the agreements that we've reached are honoured. Trust in the multilateral system also depends on armed conflicts that we are facing today being effectively and robustly addressed by this body. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, please accept our felicitations on assuming the presidency of the 79th session of the General Assembly. We thank you also for convening this resumed 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly in response to the requests of the Arab, the OIC, and the non-aligned movement. My delegation aligns with the statement made by the ambassadors of Cameroon on behalf of the OIC and of Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, the purpose of this emergency session is to translate into action the historic and comprehensive advisory opinion delivered by the International Court of Justice on 19 July 2024 on the legal consequences of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Pakistan has co-sponsored the draft resolution contained in document ES 10/L31 Rev 1, presented with its enhanced rights by the State of Palestine, which seeks to implement the conclusions of the ICJ. Mr. President, the tragic history of Palestine and its people has been caused by a series of legal and political decisions imposed by colonial and imperial powers. From the Balfour Declaration, the epitome of political betrayal, to the Anglo-American decision to allow Jews persecuted by the Nazis to emigrate to Israel, to the plan to partition Palestine embodied in the ignominious Resolution 181 adopted by this Assembly despite the just Arab and Islamic opposition, to the precipitate admission of Israel to the United Nations. Pakistan's founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, warned in 1948 that Israel's creation would have grave consequences for the peoples of the region. History is witness to these consequences. A state foisted on the land of the Palestinians, the brutal expulsion of the Palestinians in the Nakba, an expansion of the illegal state, the complete occupation of all of Palestine by Israeli military aggression in 1967, a brutal occupation which has lasted 50 years. The steady acquisition of Palestinian lands, properties, and homes to accommodate illegal and aggressive Jewish settlers. The imposition of a segregated apartheid rule in occupied Palestine. The unlawful incarceration of thousands of Palestinians subjected to torture, deprivation, and humiliation. The 30-year siege of Gaza. And now the frequent violations visited on innocent Palestinians, including indiscriminate aerial and land bombardment, killing thousands of mostly women and children, which is now writ large in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, where 41,000 Palestinians have been killed and almost 100,000 injured. A conflict which threatens to spread across and engulf the entire Middle East. Mr. President, against this grim background, the ICJ's advisory opinion marks a milestone of justice, an expression of equity, and a flame of hope. The ICJ's conclusions emphasize that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and its attempts to prolong the occupation and its security policies violate two basic principles of international law. One, the right of peoples to self-determination. And two, the principle of non-acquisition of territory by the use of force. In accordance with the ICJ's advisory opinion, the draft resolution demands that Israel immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories, immediately put an end to its unlawful policies and procedures, make reparation for damages caused, comply with the ICJ's orders, and ensure that the Palestinian people can exercise their right to self-determination without impediment. The draft resolution also underlines the need to hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law and to bear the consequences of all its wrongful actions, including by making reparations for injury and damage caused through the establishment of an international mechanism and an international register of damage. Mr. President, importantly, the ICJ's advisory opinion also indicates the obligations of member states in relation to Israel's occupation. Accordingly, the draft resolution inter alia calls on member states in compliance with their obligations to promote Palestinian self-determination, to refuse to recognize any change in the institutional structure and status of the occupied territory, and not to recognize or provide aid or assistance in maintaining Israeli occupation. Furthermore, the draft resolution calls on international organizations, including the United Nations, not to recognize as legal the situation arising from Israel's illegal occupation. The Secretary General has also been asked to submit a report on the implementation of this resolution within 3 months. Mr. President, the adoption of the draft resolution before us will require a re-evaluation of the position of member states and the United Nations, especially the Security Council, with regard to Palestine. First, this should reinvigorate the efforts of the international community to oblige Israel to halt its genocidal military campaign in Gaza and its operations in the West Bank, and to withdraw its forces forthwith from there. Second, those states which are continuing to provide military and material support to Israel must halt this in accordance with their obligation not to help in perpetuating Israeli occupation. Third, we must take concrete steps to enable the Palestinians to exercise their right to self-determination. One important step is to admit the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. Another would be to convene the International Conference on Palestine to advance the two-state solution. Mr. President, Pakistan will actively promote the realization of the objectives and decisions arising from the ICJ's advisory opinion and the adoption of the draft resolution in document L31 Rev 1. Pakistan's solidarity with the Palestinian people predates the independence of our own country. We realized independence through the exercise of self-determination. On 14 August 47, our founding father, Quaid-e-Azam, stated, and I quote, "No nation, no people who are worth living as a nation can achieve anything great without making great sacrifice, such as the Arabs of Palestine are making." In 1948, he pledged to aid the cause, I quote, "of the Arabs in Palestine in every possible way." Mr. President, we have lived up to that commitment, and we will continue to live up to that commitment. The opinion of the ICJ and the adoption of the draft resolution before us will be one decisive step towards ending the suffering of the Palestinian people. Inshallah, Palestine will soon be free. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank
you, Mr. President. I congratulate you on presiding over the General Assembly, and we would like to associate ourselves with the statements delivered by the Non-Aligned Movement, the OIC, and the Arab Group. We meet today, Mr. President, after the Arab and Islamic groups and the Non-Aligned Movement requested the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session to submit the draft resolution before us today, A/ES-10/L31, which, and for the first time in the history of the General Assembly, is being submitted by the State of Palestine, and it pertains to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem, and that is an implementation of GA Resolution 77/247 of the year 2022. Mr. President, Palestine, and with the support of peace-loving countries that believe in international law and the United Nations Charter and the need to maintain its credibility, sought this advisory opinion and seeks to have clear resolutions from the General Assembly and Security Council out of a genuine belief of the need for a peaceful solution to the Palestinian cause in accordance with international law and the United Nations Charter, and out of a sincere belief that violence will never be the solution for the conflict in the Middle East. Mr. President, the ICJ's advisory opinion reveals that the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and ending occupation and establishing a Palestinian state on the 4th of June 1967 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital is a right that is clear and evident. The ICJ also found that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip is in violation of international law. It considered occupation a blatant violation of the right to self-determination, which is a preemptory norm of international law. It also found that the continued use of armed force on foreign territories with the aim of annexing them to Israel and imposing its sovereignty on them lacks legitimacy. The Israeli practices against Palestinians in the occupied territory are in violation of Article 3 of the Convention on the Prohibition of Racial Discrimination, not to mention the findings that the ICJ arrived at that oblige Israel to end occupation, including the dismantling of its settlements, evacuating settlers, and making reparations to Palestinians, and allowing all Palestinians displaced during the occupation to return to their original place of residence. Mr. President, we remind you all that most of the points mentioned in the current ICJ opinion was acknowledged by the same court 20 years ago in its advisory opinion on the separating wall. That opinion remained as ink on paper. Mr. President, Egypt finds that the advisory opinion recognizes that the international community as a whole has legal obligations, and this applies to all member states of the United Nations. Legal obligations including working on enabling the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination. Moreover, it prohibits any measures that may imply a recognition of the occupation or the conditions it creates. This includes transferring embassies to the occupied Palestinian territory, or engaging in agreements or establishing trade ties with Israeli activities that are related to the occupation. Moreover, the advisory opinion found that the United Nations and all of its political bodies and specialized agencies are obliged as well to work on ending the occupation and taking the necessary measures to guarantee that Israel abides by the ICJ's opinion that occupation must end immediately. We stress that the Israeli occupation, with its settlements and its extremist settlers, would not be viable if countries that respect international law and the ICJ's opinions decide to boycott it and cease cooperating and coexisting with it. Putting an end to the occupation and deterring Israel's hostile behavior against the Palestinian people is an urgent necessity to maintain international peace, international security, or what remains of regional stability after Israel has gone too far in its violations perpetrated throughout its occupation of the Palestinian territories. Moreover, Israel has gone too far in its aggression against the United Nations itself, in that it killed more than 220 United Nations staff members, as it continues to adopt a law that would criminalize the UNRWA and consider it a terrorist organization. This is an unprecedented action where a United Nations body is labeled as terrorist. Mr. President, the ICJ's opinion comes out as the Israeli war machine continues to destroy the Gaza Strip. It has killed over 40,000 martyrs and has injured over 94,000 Palestinians. It has obstructed the delivery of humanitarian aid in a violation of international law and relevant United Nations resolutions, especially Resolution 2720, issued by the Security Council. There is no clear horizon to put an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Moreover, Israel is launching a military campaign against the West Bank, and it encourages settlement activity in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It threatens the status quo of religious holy places in Jerusalem. It continues to enforce limitations on the work of the Palestinian Authority, which is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. All of this aims to eliminate the presence of Palestinians on their land and to liquidate their cause. Mr. President, here we would like to renew our demands that the Security Council must issue a resolution under Chapter 7 that would oblige Israel to immediately cease hostilities and to allow the unfettered access of humanitarian aid to maintain international peace and security and hold Israel accountable for its violation of international law and its non-implementation of Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, Egypt believes in supporting regional peace and stability. In that, we continue our mediation efforts along with Qatar and the United States to arrive at a ceasefire deal and to put an end to this unprecedented tragedy. Egypt is doing so within its regional and international responsibilities, and we choose to disregard some reckless statements made by the Israeli Prime Minister against Egypt. These statements only aim to distract Israeli public opinion and obstruct mediation efforts. Egypt will continue working with our Arab brethren and international partners to resume the peace process and to launch a mediation process a negotiations process that would guarantee the Palestinian people the right in a liberated country that is contiguous on the lands within the borders of the 4th of June 1967, with Jerusalem at its capital, in accordance with international criteria and resolutions and the peace process which acknowledges the two-state solution. This requires us all to exert a genuine effort and to be committed by turning words into deeds in the international community and through responding with and working with Arab efforts. This requires a firm position with Israel to force it to return to the negotiations table and end occupation after the recent escalation shows the impossibility of the theory that Israel's security is based on force and power. For the sake of what is right, for the sake of what is just, Egypt asks you to vote in favor of the draft resolution that will be presented tomorrow in order to maintain and preserve the credibility of this organization, to support a peaceful resolution to the Palestinian cause and other causes, to maintain our rights to live in dignity and in freedom, and to uphold justice and what is right. I thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, let me begin by congratulating you on assuming the presidency of the General Assembly and to express our appreciation for convening this 10th emergency special session. This session reflects the gravity of the situation and the collective responsibility of this body to address it. As a co-sponsor of this resolution introduced by Palestine and a committed advocate of the International Court of Justice proceedings, Turkey regards this session as both timely and essential. Mr. President, the Court's advisory opinion delivered on July 19th, upon the request of this august body, categorically determined the illegality of Israel's deliberately prolonged occupation of Palestinian territories. The ICJ's ruling, as the highest judicial body within the UN system, reaffirms what has long been the consensus of the international community, which is the occupation is lawful and must be ended. This conclusion not only provides a legal foundation, but also reinforces the political will of the majority of member states. The forthcoming vote on the resolution presented by Palestine is of historical significance. It not only constitutes the first resolution presented by Palestine to the General Assembly, but also symbolizes a pivotal step in the Palestinian people's pursuit of justice. The resolution is not merely procedural. It is emblematic of a broader movement within the international community to rectify long-standing injustices. Therefore, vital that we, as the member states, act in line with the ICJ's findings and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Turkey urges all member states to support this resolution as it is consistent with the international law and the legal framework established by the ICJ. The resolution's adoption would mark a crucial reaffirmation of the collective commitment to upholding international legal norms. Mr. President, this resolution underscores three critical dimensions of the current situation. First, it reinforces the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. Implementing the Court's advisory opinion is imperative if we are to uphold the core principle that territorial acquisition by force is inadmissible. Second, the international community must signal clearly that violations of international law will not be tolerated. The occupation and ongoing settlement activities in the West Bank are not only illegal, but undermine the prospects for peace. Accountability in this case is not just a moral imperative, but a legal one. Third, the ongoing conflict in Gaza, now in its 11th month, exacerbates an already dire humanitarian crisis. The resolutions passed by this Assembly, as well as the Security Council resolutions 2728 and 2725, calling for a ceasefire, remain unheeded. The suffering of the Palestinian people continues unabated, and the lack of the implementation highlights the urgent need for concrete action. Adoption of the resolution is crucial to reinforce the international community's call for a ceasefire and to halt the illegal settlement activities that perpetuate the conflict. Turkey has been an active participant in the ICJ process, contributing both written and oral submissions to the advisory opinion. We will continue our efforts to ensure an immediate and lasting ceasefire, as well as unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and work towards the recognition of the State of Palestine and a viable two-state solution. In conclusion, the decisions made in this Assembly will have lasting implications, not only for the Palestine, but for the credibility of international law and the UN. The international community must demonstrate that it is prepared to enforce the standards it has set, and that justice, even if it is delayed, will ultimately prevail. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting. Mr. President, international law is the pillar of a stable global society, ensuring justice, protection of freedom, and enabling countries to thrive. Without them, chaos disrupts global peace and progress. The ICJ, the world's court, has made it clear: Israel's occupation of Palestine is illegal. Continued global inaction, enabled through the might is right, has allowed this occupation to thrive, causing injustice and tremendous suffering to the Palestinian people. The Assembly must now act on the ICJ ruling. The occupation must end. Indonesia, therefore, wholeheartedly support the draft resolution tabled by the State of Palestine. It contains legitimate actions that address these injustices. In this context, allow me to emphasize 3 points. First, Implementation of the ICJ advisory opinion is the embodiment of our belief and commitment to international law and order. The ruling is more than just legal authority. It is a moral imperative. All states must recognize the state of Palestine, support the full membership in the United Nations, and uphold its rights to self-determination. The systematic structure of apartheid, discrimination, and injustice must be dismantled. Second, we must safeguard the integrity of the UN Charter and our basic human value. Allowing the illegal occupation of Palestine to continue undermines the very foundation of the international system that was built to preserve justice, moral value, and humanity. Let us be honest. Can we say to the children in Gaza, in the West Bank, and East Jerusalem that there will be a tomorrow for them? No, we cannot. We cannot even say this to children staying in Israelis' designated humanitarian safe zone. In the eyes of the general public, this body's default position is standing idle, while the basic right to life of Palestinians is taken away by a vindictive government. What will remain of the sanctity of international law? Third, we must pursue political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The clarity of the ICJ ruling is the illegality of Israel occupation of Palestine. We must demand all of us to take a clear political will that we must safeguard the two-state solution. We need to convene an international conference for peace negotiation where Palestine stands on equal footing. The time for decisive action is now. We must move towards peace. Mr. President, let us act to resolve, to ensure that the promise of peace and dignity becomes a reality for every child and human being in Gaza and beyond. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
President, Excellencies, on 19 July, the International Court of Justice, upon the request of this General Assembly, delivered its advisory opinion regarding the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The court found that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, and that it is under an obligation to end it as soon as possible. Among the legal consequences emanating from this advisory opinion is a responsibility on the part of the General Assembly, as well as the Security Council, to consider the precise modalities and further action required to end Israel's unlawful presence. In this context, Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to international law. Adherence to it is essential to advancing peace, security, and justice. Respecting and implementing the findings of international judicial institutions, including the ICJ, is fundamental. All states must respect the decisions of our institutions and cooperate fully in their implementation. Our multilateral system depends on it. President, across the occupied Palestinian territory, Palestinians have been facing a desperate reality for 57 years. They are forced to contend with discriminatory legislation and frequent human rights violations. A continued occupation will only serve to make the two-state solution and the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination seem like a distant and unattainable abstraction. As member states, we have a responsibility to move this forward, a duty outlined by the ICJ. This includes not recognizing as legal Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining this occupation. All settlement activities must cease immediately. They are illegal under international law, undermine the contiguity of a future Palestinian state, and are a breach of the Palestinian people's fundamental right to self-determination. President, tens of thousands of civilians have been killed in the Gaza war, and many more have had their lives destroyed. Hostages abducted by Hamas and their families continue to live through a perpetual nightmare. An immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza needs to be realized urgently. The hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. We have echoed this message consistently since 7th October. This catastrophic war has only illustrated the need to address the root causes of this conflict and take tangible steps towards the realization of the two-state solution in line with Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. This path requires courage, principled decisions, and full respect of international law. This is why Malta will be supporting the resolution before us today. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
Mr. President, in the outset, allow me to speak in English, as I wish today to have my messages sent clear and not lost in translation. At the same time, I would like to align myself with the statements of the Arab group, the Islamic group, and the non-alignment movement. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to debate this resolution regarding the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legal consequences arising from the unlawful occupation by the Israeli forces of the Palestinian territory, which Libya was proud to join its deliberations. This resolution presented by the delegation of the State of Palestine is by itself a historic moment, being the first action they take after getting their deserved, long-awaited privileges since the starting of this 29th year session. Unfortunately, they had to wait 79 years for that to happen. So in that regard, it's important to remind you that it's about time also to grant them the full membership of the United Nations. But while I'm standing here before you today, I find myself challenged and struggling to understand what are we exactly debating. Ordinary people watching us would question this, because simply we are debating whether we should comply with the legal findings of the most prominent, prestigious international institution, the International Court of Justice. We are debating whether or not we should comply with international law. As much as this ICJ advisory is important and timely, but we should not at all neglect the fact that the occupation of the Palestinian territories has been and will remain unlawful. And none of you ever needed to wait all these decades for such advisory opinion to know that. But here we are. And the real test begins now. The real test today is for those countries who preach and call others to respect international law and rule of law. So what will your position be now? The real test today is for those countries who preach and call others to stick to principles, respect the UN Charter, and to comply with the decisions of its organs and bodies. So what will your position be now? The real test today is for those countries who watched the ongoing massacres and the genocide in Gaza for almost a year and witnessed the systematic destruction and dehumanization conducted by an apartheid regime for decades. So what will your position be now? On which side of history are you going to be on? What will the books of history say about you? What are you going to tell your people if you happen to vote against this resolution or even abstain? What excuse are you going to use to justify such decision? If you can't vote for peace and justice and against occupation and illegal settlements? How you'll be able to ask for support if one day you're occupied? How will you explain if your government supports in any way such occupation in violation of international law and not hold those who do so accountable? And what will you say to those who will aim at you and say, "Welcome to the world of double standards"? And talking about double standards, just a while ago, we heard the representative of the occupying Israeli forces bashing you all, as he does with his predecessors, perform a show and teaching us and lecturing us about humanity and morality, totally disconnected from reality. Even today, he couldn't bring any justification nor speak about the topic we're discussing, the illegal settlements. He could not address the resolution and trying to show that the world started only on October the 7th, neglecting the fact of history. Well, if he considers this assembly a circus, guess what? I consider him a clown performing in this place, always bringing his preps, trying to produce a show, failing to make us laugh, deceiving us from reality. That's what they try to do, but they fail dramatically. So when I ask him if he thinks this place is a circus, why are you performing in it? Why are you still a member in it? Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for you to show action and not words. Nearly a year will pass and the massacres and genocide in Gaza and the West Bank is continuing. The inability of the international community, especially the Security Council, to stop these atrocities and reach a ceasefire, and the silence of many of you, is what allowed the killing of tens of thousands, injuring hundreds of thousands, the displacement of almost 2 million, the spread of famine and diseases. So today, do some justice for those innocent and vote in favor of this resolution, which would be a message from the world to the occupying forces and who support them blindly. Say enough is enough, and it's time to act. Libya reaffirms its position that it won't define resistance against occupation as terrorism, and who from your countries didn't gain their independence without resistance, especially when the doors of peaceful solutions are completely shut down. Libya affirms its position that the only peaceful solution to this 7 decades of aggression and occupation is by recognizing the Palestinians' right to defend themselves and resist occupation and the right of self-determination, and having an independent state with Jerusalem, its capital. In conclusion, it's time now for all to comply and respect the outcome of the ICJ. This court, which we all know has established or was established to help in ensuring peace and justice, where international law should prevail over the use of force. Therefore, we call on you all to vote in favor of this resolution to pave the road for peace. History will remember those countries which have taken a principle, a moral, a legal or humane stance, and it will also remember those who had their humanity in deep coma and were aware and deliberately participated in this live broadcasted atrocity, especially the 21st century Holocaust, the Holocaust of Gaza. Voting in favor of this resolution today is a vote for peace, and it's a vote for justice. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Libya. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
Mr. President, at the outset, I congratulate you on your election as President of the General Assembly in its 79th session. I thank you for responding to our request to resume the 10th Emergency Special Session. United for Peace. Jordan aligns itself with the statements of the Arab Group, OIC, and NAM. Mr. President, our session today convenes to look into the draft resolution tabled by the Brotherly Palestinian delegation in light of the advisory opinion of the ICJ, which was issued in July, concerning the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, in response to the request of the General Assembly end of 2022. Jordan expresses its full support of the draft resolution, and we invite the member states to vote in its favor. Mr. President, Jordan considers the advisory opinion of the ICJ a watershed moment in the history of the Palestinian question. The opinion stated what we are aware of, which is that the Israeli occupation is illegal and that the presence of Israeli settlements and settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories is illegal and void, and that the Israeli practices against the Palestinian people languishing under occupation are racist practices in the first place that amount to racial discrimination and apartheid. Mr. President, implementing the ICJ's advisory opinion is an obligation for us as states, international organizations, and international community. In this advisory opinion, the court has reflected the position of international law from the Palestinian question, from the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian right to self-determination, and from the grave Israeli violations of the jus cogens of international law. In the near future, we will see how the content of this advisory opinion will be reflected in the legal procedures that will be adopted by the national and regional courts and by member states against the occupation and against Israeli practices. In line with the advisory opinion and the submission submitted by Jordan before the ICJ, we reaffirm the fact that Israeli policies in the occupied Palestinian territories aim at undermining the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The international community cannot allow this. Therefore, we emphasize the need to compel Israel to implement the advisory opinion in this regard, including ending the ongoing Israeli occupation since June 1967 as soon as possible, and immediately ending all the settlement activities, evacuating the settlers from the occupied Palestinian territories, and ending their arbitrary oppressive practices against the Palestinian people on their occupied territories. Mr. President, we reiterate our full support to the advisory opinion, which compels Israel to restore properties to their legal owners and to provide compensation to those affected by the Israeli practices and policies in the occupied Palestinian territory. We also support the measures included in the Palestinian draft resolution, including ending the import and procurement of goods manufactured in settlements and also ending the provision of weapons to Israel, in addition to ending all measures ending violations aiming at changing the historic status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Refraining from providing support to Israel to continue its crimes and violations against the Palestinian people is not an intellectual luxury. It is a legal obligation on all states and on the international community as a whole. Those supporting the settlements should refrain from doing so, and the companies feeding the Israeli killing machinery against the Palestinian people should also refrain from doing so, and those supporting the measures of Israel aiming at creating a new reality on the ground against Palestine should understand that this is bound to fail. Mr. President, the advisory opinion emphasized the unity of the Palestinian territory and the right of return of the Palestinians. It rejected forced displacement. Therefore, there is a need to implement this advisory opinion using all possible legal means by adopting the necessary national legislations, in addition to the individual and collective measures to implement that goal. There is also a need to intensify international efforts to put further pressure on Israel to end their hideous crimes against the Palestinian people in Gaza, which have claimed the lives of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians since the onset of the barbaric Israeli war a year ago. The Security Council and the international community should put pressure on Israel to end the war immediately and to allow the sufficient and sustainable delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip, and to refrain from targeting UN and relief staff, and to implement relevant Security Council resolutions, mainly Resolution 2735. We call upon the international community to take a unified position condemning the ongoing unilateral Israeli practices and their violations of the historic status quo in Jerusalem. The international community should compel Israel and its extremist government to end their violations in the West Bank and policies aiming at dragging the region into a global regional war with devastating consequences. In conclusion, Mr. President, we reiterate the historic and absolute support of Jordan to the right of Palestinians to self-determination and to the establishment of their sovereign independent state along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, with East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem as a capital, pursuant to relevant UN resolutions and on the basis of the two-state solution, which is the only way to achieve comprehensive peace. We reaffirm the need for Israel to respect the historic status quo of Jerusalem and the Islamic and Christian holy sites in the frame of the Jordanian custodianship on these sites. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, we gather today to discuss the question of Palestine, a stark reminder of the importance of multilateral action, but at the same time, a proof of the limits of its frameworks, including these very United Nations. On the one hand, without the international law, without the global fora of nations, the Palestinian cause would have faded into oblivion in a world dominated by narrow interests. On the other hand, multilateral action has shown its limitation, despite the consensus of the international community and the successive binding resolution that plainly affirm and reaffirm the Palestinian rights to self-determination, Palestinian right to their land, Palestinian right to their statehood. Yes, we find ourselves unable to enforce them. This failure stems from an occupying power that disregards international law and thrives on impunity, acting as though it is above the law. In Gaza, in the West Bank, the Israeli occupier continue to kill, continue to arrest, with the toll of victims surpassing in nearly 1 year 41,000 martyrs, almost 100,000 wounded, and more than 10,000 Palestinian detainees. The Israeli occupying power desecrates holy sites of Al-Quds Sharif and forcibly displace its people. Just this morning, we witnessed another assault from Israeli settlers protected by the Israeli police into the mosque of Al-Aqsa. The occupying power openly denies the right of the Palestinian people and seeks to undermine the establishment of their states. Mr. President, in light of this bleak reality, which threatens to extinguish hope in the heart of the Palestinians and peace lovers around the world. The advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice came. This historic and comprehensive decision by the highest judicial body in the world challenges the Israeli occupation narrative and exposes its apartheid policies. It reaffirms the illegality of Israel occupation of Palestinian territories and the need to its end. Now, as President Abdelmajid Tebboune has emphasized, and I quote, "We, the advocates of the just peace, bear the responsibility to end the historic injustice inflicted on the Palestinian people, an outcome achievable only by compelling the occupying power to comply with international law." End of quote. Mr. President, the voice of justice has spoken, and it is imperative that we shall all abide by its ruling. Failing to do so will disrupt the very foundations of the international order. We should ensure the full implementation of the ICJ advisory opinion. For this purpose, the State of Palestine submitted to the General Assembly this historic draft resolution. And this draft is historic in its significance, as it is the first resolution submitted by the State of Palestine in its national capacity in the history of the United Nations. It is another victory on the path to full membership to the United Nations. It is also historic in its content, as it outlines a roadmap to end the occupation and enable the Palestinian people to fully enjoy their rights. My country, Algeria, having always stood by Palestine, promptly sponsored this draft resolution and call on all members to support it, to vote in favor of it. Today, we must be united in our support, in our solidarity with the Palestinian people. We must stand together in defense of international law. We must stand united for peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, the United States has worked with determination to support a comprehensive peace agreement that would permanently resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no other path that both guarantees Israel's security and future as a democratic Jewish state and ensures Palestinians can live in peace and dignity in a state of their own. Consistent with this position, we have long opposed unilateral measures that undermine the prospect of a two-state solution. That includes the advancement of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and it includes the resolution that the Palestinian delegation has put before us today. For the better part of 4 decades, the United States has been clear about our policy concerns with Israel's program of settlements. Earlier this year, we also expressed the view that the program of settlements is inconsistent with international law. We maintain firm opposition to settlement expansion, which in our judgment only weakens Israel's security. The United States also respects the important role of the International Court of Justice in advising the UN General Assembly and in helping peacefully settle disputes. However, adoption of a one-sided resolution that selectively interprets the substance of the ICJ's opinion does not advance what we all want to see, and that is progress toward 2 states living in peace, side by side. This proposed resolution advances the flawed and indeed false idea that adopting a text here in New York can somehow resolve what is easily one of the most complex and persistent diplomatic challenges of our time. Colleagues, we all know that is not true. We all know, as the Security Council has repeatedly underscored, that a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must be achieved through negotiations between the 2 parties. Negotiations grounded in some basic principles, including the notion of land for peace. Regrettably, but very significantly, the Palestinian resolution makes no mention of this reality. It also fails to acknowledge, among other things, that Hamas, a terrorist organization, is currently exerting power, control, and influence in Gaza. And it refuses to address the reality that Israel, a United Nations member state, simply has a right to protect and defend its people from acts of terror or violence. I understand the last few months have been devastating for the Palestinian people. Families have endured hell in Gaza and the West Bank due to the new round of fighting Hamas set in motion on October 7th. But the resolution put forward by the Palestinian delegation does nothing to end the current conflict with Hamas in Gaza, nothing to bring the hostages home to their families, and nothing to surge life-saving assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. It does not offer a concrete path forward for how, consistent with Security Council Resolution 2735, the Palestinian Authority in Gaza intends to reunify the Gaza Strip with the West Bank. It does not address calls for reform of the Palestinian Authority, not only from the international community, including numerous Arab states, but also from the Palestinian people. And despite the fact that Hamas just upended ceasefire negotiations by brutally murdering 6 hostages, and despite the fact that Hamas continues to use Palestinian civilians as human shields in Gaza, this resolution does not include any measures to pressure Hamas to heed Security Council Resolution 2735, accept the deal on the table, and implement it without delay or further conditions. Colleagues, using inflammatory language in this text is not going to advance the cause of peace. Demanding every member state impose economic sanctions on Israel and its officials is not going to reinvigorate the peace process, let alone create a path toward a two-state solution. Creating more special committees and convening a conference ostensibly for no other purpose than to pressure Israel is not a viable substitute for the one thing we all know, and that is the Security Council and General Assembly have long agreed is necessary to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is direct negotiations. Rather, and much like other symbolic gestures pursued by the Palestinian delegation in recent months, many of which do little or nothing to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, this resolution is a stark reminder that there are no shortcuts to peace. Colleagues, in the dark months since October 7th, I've heard and sensed a feeling of hopelessness regarding the prospects for peace, not only between Israeli and Palestinians, but more broadly in the region. But we must not be guided by fear and despair. We know what needs to be done to achieve peace, starting with an immediate ceasefire with hostage release based on the principles of Security Council Resolution 2735. The United States will continue to do everything possible to put forward ideas and proposals to achieve a deal that would help lay the foundation for a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. But there is no path forward or hope offered through this resolution today. Its adoption will not save Palestinian lives, bring the hostages home, end Israeli settlements, or reinvigorate the peace process. For that reason, I urge you to vote no and to instead join the United States in pressing both parties, Israelis and Palestinians, to recommit to the hard work of direct negotiations and to press Hamas to take the deal on the table. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen,
My delegation would like to align itself with the statements delivered by the Syrian Arab Republic on behalf of the Arab Group, Cameroon on behalf of the OIC, and Uganda on behalf of NAM. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, and your Vice Presidents on assuming the presidency of the General Assembly in its 79th session. We wish you every luck, and we thank you for resuming the 10th emergency special session to follow up on the advisory opinion of the ICJ on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and from the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. The ICJ concluded on the 19th of July 2024 that the ongoing presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal. It must be ended, and the resulting settlement activities must be addressed. The ICJ also found that Israel is obligated to provide reparation for damages, and that international organizations, including the United Nations, are required not to recognize the legality of the situation resulting from this illegal presence. The advisory opinion was issued based on the request of the GA in its resolution 77/247 on the 30th of December 2022. Mr. President, my country welcomed the advisory opinion of the ICJ on Israel's policies and practices, and we welcome the fact that it confirmed the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, maintaining international peace and security is among the top priority of this organization. Today, it is evident that this organization was either late or was unable to carry out this role. Its delay in reaching a just and comprehensive solution for the Palestinian question caused a humanitarian tragedy for decades and led to the tragic consequences that we are witnessing today. Israel, the occupying power, is perpetrating all forms of crimes against the Palestinian people. It ignores the resolutions of international legitimacy, international law, and international humanitarian law. It even believes that it is above these resolutions and the law. It believes that it has immunity against accountability. This is why it persists in its aggressive policies, and it persists in perpetrating all forms of crimes and in carrying out procedures to violate the Palestinian rights. Mr. President, the advisory opinion of the ICJ is in line with the belief of the international community regarding the rights of the Palestinian people. It reaffirms that illegal Israeli practices that went on for decades continue to escalate violations against the Palestinian people. We look forward for an immediate follow-up to implement this advisory opinion to address this historic injustice that has lasted for far too long. The international community, represented by the General Assembly of the United Nations, is called upon to guarantee the respect of this advisory opinion and is called upon to monitor the implementation of the obligation of Israel, the true activation that we all aspire to of the role of the United Nations commences with respecting its resolutions and strengthening the role of its bodies. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia looks forward to the adoption of today's draft resolution, and we call on peace-loving nations to vote in favor of this resolution as it reaffirms the respect of the international community for the advisory opinion of the ICJ. It reaffirms Palestinian rights and reaffirms the beginning of a process towards peace. We also reaffirm the need for practical and credible steps to reach a just and comprehensive solution for the Palestinian question
pursuant to the Arab Peace Initiative and the resolutions of international legitimacy in order to guarantee the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the establishment of an independent state along the lines of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
Mr. President, the advisory opinion of 19 July by the International Court of Justice is a highly important ruling from the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. The court's message could hardly have been any clearer. Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes a wrongful act of a continuing character. This has been brought about by Israel's violations of the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force and the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. Consequently, the court states that Israel has an obligation to bring an end to this unlawful presence as rapidly as possible. The court also reaffirms that Israel's settlement activity violates international law and furthermore concludes that Israel must immediately stop all new settlement activity, evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory, repeal all legislation and measures creating or maintaining the unlawful situation, and provide full compensation to all affected Palestinians. This is an unequivocal message which Israel must comply with without delay. The court further emphasizes that all other states are required to not assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel. It urges the UN General Assembly and the Security Council to consider measures to help put an end to the illegal presence. This places a responsibility on all of us. A resolution building on ICJ's advisory opinion will be put to a vote. It is aligned with the court's opinion and aims at ensuring that the latter is upheld. Norway will therefore vote in favor. And we encourage everyone to do the same. Respect for international law is a prerequisite for maintaining global peace and security. Mr. President, turning to the dramatic situation on the ground, Norway continues to call for an immediate ceasefire and the release of all remaining hostages who remain in captivity after Hamas's terror attack on 7 October, which we have condemned in the strongest possible terms. After more than 11 months of war, the situation in Gaza is catastrophic. The scale of destruction, the massive number of casualties, and the extreme humanitarian needs are unprecedented. The living hell that the civilians in Gaza are going through every single day is happening on our watch. No one can claim that we do not understand the extent of the ongoing violence and destruction. Still, we have been unable to prevent it. That is unforgivable. In the occupied West Bank, the rapidly deteriorating situation is highly dangerous and could have serious implications for a region already on the brink of a full-scale war. The dire economic situation, recent large-scale Israeli military operations, and unabated settler violence continue to inflict severe harm on the local Palestinian population, and all contribute to the escalation of an already tense situation. Mr. President, the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, as reaffirmed by the court in its advisory opinion. According to the court, Israel has the occupying power, has an obligation not to impede the Palestinian people from exercising this right to self-determination. This includes the right to an independent and sovereign state over the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel's continued occupation and unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is not compatible with the realization of a strong Palestinian state and ultimately a two-state solution. There is no way to provide lasting security for both Palestinians and Israelis without the establishment of a Palestinian state. A two-state solution requires an Israeli and a Palestinian state. Norway's recent recognition of the State of Palestine reaffirms Norway's long-standing commitment to the two-state solution through the establishment of a sovereign, democratic, contiguous, and viable state of Palestine living side by side with the State of Israel in peace and within secure and recognized borders. Through this recognition, Norway affirms its support for the Palestinian leadership, who is committed to the two-state solution, to diplomacy, and abstention from violence in its efforts to achieve peace. Norway is of the view that the great majority of all states supports the realization of the two-state solution. Let us therefore also commit to taking concrete and irreversible steps towards this end. It is more urgent than ever. Mr. President, the current trajectory is not sustainable. A change of course is urgently needed. The court has provided a framework to remedy the situation. It deserves all our attention, and I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. This meeting is adjourned.